Muy buenos días y bienvenidos de nuevo a Área 2021. Vamos a tener esta sesión 9 que es excepcional por su contenido, por el tema y por los ponentes. Vamos a tratar el cálculo de lentes intraoculares. Parte de la sesión la vamos a hacer en inglés, en particular el debate, dado que tenemos distinguidísimos compañeros internacionales que van a participar en ello. Tengo a Francisco Poyales, querido compañero de Miranza, que va a estar conmigo moderando esta sesión, y tenemos en el panel de debate a compañeros como son Joaquín Fernández, Javier Mendicute, Giacomo Sabini y Emeterio Orduña, que van a discutir con nosotros y van a debatir los temas que a continuación vamos a explicar. Tenemos un panel de expertos magnífico. La keynote la va a desarrollar Jaime Aranberri, seguido de Warren Hill, Graham Barrett y David Harten, que son tal vez los nombres más importantes que ahora mismo hay en el mundo sobre cálculo de lentes intraoculares. Por lo tanto, a todos ellos les doy las gracias por su tiempo, porque van a estar online y por su amistad de tantos años. Esta sesión está patrocinada por Biotech, de la cual vamos a dar ahora un mensaje que nos ha enviado para todos vosotros.
Nos estresa que la lente se pueda voltear.
Un paso importante, o sea, es una lente muy buena.
Y esto no va a pasar con la lente iCream.
Y especialmente tamaños de 13. Nos van a hacer que tengamos un control.
El material de la lente Optiflex es un material muy resistente a la formación de microvacuolas.
And this may be the best hydrophobic in lenses I've never implanted.
Y con una rapidez de resultados bastante impresionante.
Es una de las escasísimas lentes con las que me siento cómodo.
Confirman una respuesta excelente a todas las distancias.
De una manera mucho más agradable, mucho más amistosa y con menos posibilidad de que podamos encontrar algún volteo a la hora de poner la lente en cámara anterior.
O sea, quirúrgicamente se comporta de forma excelente y el aspecto de la lente es excelente.
Los estudios de laboratorio sugieren una gran seguridad.
Muy bien, pues comienza la sesión. Paco, tienes la palabra.
Muy bien, pues lo primero, estoy entusiasmado de estar en esta sesión porque realmente has conseguido un panel de expertos que es difícil de conseguir. Bueno, empezamos entonces por nuestro compañero Jaime Aranberri, calculando lentes multifocales tras LASIK PRK, un reto.
Good morning, it's a pleasure to be here in Área 2021. The implantation of multifocal IOLs in postcorneal refractive surgery eyes is controversial. There is a balance between a worse optical performance when compared to the combination of monofocal IOLs and normal corneas and the aim of getting rid of glasses. But good clinical results can be achieved if the eye meets some conditions: good visual acuity or quality history after corneal refractive surgery, not a high level of corneal higher order aberrations, and I give this published number as a reference, and good surface quality. This is no dry eye and an homogeneous OCT epithelial map. But the main limitation is the IOL power calculation accuracy, which is worse than in normal eyes. Pantanelli recently performed a literature review and showed us that the number of cases within plus minus 0.5 diopters of predicted refraction is lower than in the normal eyes. The best methods achieve around 60 to 65% of eyes within this range. And for the range of plus minus 1 diopter of predicted refraction, things are even worse. The best methods are achieving around 85 to 90% of cases, which means that there is a significant number of outliers. Since the first years after corneal refractive surgery, we learned that after myopic laser and also after radial keratotomy, normally we ended in a hyperopic refractive error, while after hyperopic laser, we normally ended in a myopic side. So it's interesting to understand why, because this will lead to a correct management of the problem. We have identified 4 sources of error. The first one can be called the ELP estimation error. So formulas that use the cornea to predict the ELP will commit this error. After myopic surgery, the very flat cornea will lead to an underestimation of both the ELP and the IOL power, ending in a hyperopic refraction. While after hyperopic surgery, the situation will be just the opposite, and the final refractive error will be in the myopic side. 1 millimeter of ELP error will finally bring an spectacle refraction error of around 1.4 diopter for the average eye. It's interesting to know which formulas are using the cornea as an ELP predictor and which are not. The number 2 is a keratometric error that can be called the measurement area error. Keratometers and topographers measure the K value from an annular area of around 3 millimeters of diameter. If the cornea is very flat, the measured area will be bigger and the K will be overestimated. While after hyperopic surgery, a very steep cornea will be measured in a smaller area, and the K will again be overestimated as the measurement is more central. So the final exact error in both cases will depend on the corneal shape. The third source of error is also a keratometric error, and this is the anterior to posterior ratio error. We know that the K value is quite correct as long as the anterior to posterior corneal relationship is normal. And there is a parameter which is the anterior to posterior ratio, which is around 121 with a standard deviation of 0.02. So after myopic laser, you can see in the graphic that this number moves upwards towards the right side, and this will lead to a K overestimation. While after hyperopic laser and after radiokeratotomy, the number will decrease, going to the left of the figure, and this will mean finally a K underestimation. And finally, the last source of error is the variability, which will be among cases, because there are many different post-refractive corneas, some of them with old profiles, small optical zones, some of them with modern profiles, bigger optical zones, so they behave optically differently. This can probably explain the different results among series. Also among instruments, because there is a worse agreement and worse precision of the measurements. And finally, there is some time variability. There is a difference among visits due to different factors, biomechanics, surface, etc. And you can see in this example one case with two different visits 1.5 months apart with very different K values, just doing nothing. This is just evolution. So measurements can vary significantly. So now that we understand the sources of error, we could put the solutions. So for the first one, we can use a formula that doesn't use the K for the ELP. And three very well-known examples can be the Huygens formula, the Olsen C-constant algorithm, and the Oculix method. Or we can still use a formula that uses the K value, but splitting the K in a precorneal refractive surgery K value for the ELP estimation and a postcorneal refractive surgery. This is the present day K value for the optical calculation. This is the double K method. For the second error, we should adjust the measurement area to 3 mm in the topographer. And this will depend, how to do it will depend on the device. Each device has a different methodology to do this. Normally, keratometers don't allow doing this. For the third source of error, we should use a formula that adjusts the K value to this situation. And there have been published dozens of formulas through the years that do this. A very well-known one is the Barrett true K. Or we can alternatively measure the posterior cornea with a Scheimpflug or an OCT, which quite simplifies the situation. And for the fourth source of error, we first should classify the case to determine the calculation method and I will explain about this a little later. And we should measure with different instruments, and we should measure, if possible, more than one day. So it's very important to get good quality measurements. The corneal topography will be the key to classify the case. So if we are dealing with a regular topography, we can use paraxial optics with any of the published formulas to perform the calculation. But the more we move to the right in this figure and the cornea becomes more irregular, we should start using exact optics, because paraxial optics will be senseless. If the topography is centered and we have regular astigmatism, we are dealing with an abnormal anterior to posterior ratio, curvature, which will be very flat or very steep, and an abnormal shape. If the topography is decentered, then we will add asymmetry. So in the first column, we are dealing with a spherical aberration with the wrong measurement area and the keratometric error, while in the decentered case, we are also dealing with other higher order aberrations, mainly coma. So in the first case, we can perform the calculation with confidence with the regular paraxial formulas adapted to this situation. And some examples are the Barrett-Truquet, the Higg-Giselle, all those included in the ASCRS calculator, etc. But if we are calculating a decentered topography, then calculation should be done using topographic data and using exact ray tracing, because the metrics we need are further than the K value. So for a centered pattern, we've got dozens of methods published through the years, and we can distinguish them depending on if we've got data from the pre-corneal refractive surgery state, or if we don't have those data. And then we can distinguish between if we have posterior corneal measurements or we don't. So in the first case, if we have this pre-refractive surgery data, this knowledge will improve the ELP prediction applying the double K method, for example. And also this will improve the estimation of the total corneal power if we cannot measure the posterior cornea. For example, the Barrett-Truquet with previous data will achieve its best performance, which will be around 70% of cases in plus minus 0.5 diopters of the predicted refraction. If we don't have history data and we don't have the posterior corneal measurements, outcomes will be a little worse than in the other conditions. And if we can measure the posterior cornea, the results will be the best. It has to be remarked that apparently the OCT posterior corneal measurements are more accurate than the Schoenflug's, as you can see in these numbers with the IOLMaster TK and the anterior posterior corneal measurements. And if there is a high level of irregular astigmatism, we should do the calculation by ray tracing. We can do it by ourselves, and this is the method that I've been doing the last years, developed by Pablo Perez. The drawback is that we need a complex optical design software, the data of the IOL we are using, and an IOL position predicting algorithm. So we export the topographic data to CMAX, and there we do the optical calculations, where the optimization in our case is done with this parameter, the through focus visual strail. And we can also use some commercial software fortunately available, like Oculix, which is in many biometers and tomographers, and the CSO software that is found in the Sirius and the MS39. So here I will bring some cases to end the presentation. For example, this is a regular case where we've got a centered topography. So remember that first we've got to classify the case. So the case not very flat, slightly oblate. Similar numbers for the topo and the keratometry. You can see up there the difference between the SIM K and the 3mm K. So here we can use confidently a approximation method that compensates, of course, that anterior to posterior ratio error and avoids the formula ELP error. So, for example, all of these will make it well. And these are the predictions. And take a look, this is what actually happened in the case. So you can see that the prediction error was pretty low. This is another different case. Here we've got a very flat cornea with a small optical zone. This is clearly an old treatment. And you can see the main difference here up there. There is a big difference between the SIM K of the topographer and the 3 mm K of the same topographer. So clearly there is we are measuring in a very big area, much wider than it should be. So we can use the same parameters as we've got a centered topography, but we've got to modify that measurement area. So then you need to take that 31.77 from the 3 mm topographic. And doing so, you can see that we can again obtain quite an accurate prediction. Finally, this is a very decentered topography with a very small optical zone after radial keratotomy. You can see up there a very big difference between the SIM-K and the 3 mm area. So here, as there is a big decentration, the ideal calculation should be done by exact ray tracing. Because normally if we just input that K value, the cornea will not be very well represented, because that prepupillary cornea is very multifocal. Here in this case, curiously, results were not that bad with the regular calculations, but you can see in the last row the ray tracing calculation by the CSO, which rendered a very accurate prediction. In conclusion, IOL power calculations can be accurate after corneal refractive surgery. Understanding the sources of error allows a correct management of each case, applying the adequate calculation method. But the accuracy is a little lower than in regular eyes, and this can constitute a limitation for the implantation of multifocal IOLs, especially in extreme cases. Thank you very much.
Realmente ha sido tremendamente interesante. Muchísimas gracias, Jaime, como siempre. Okay, our next speaker is Warren Hill. Well, he has made a revolution in the calculation of intraocular lenses with using the artificial intelligence and the big data. And well, this is a different way to face this problem. So go ahead, Warren.
Hello, this is Warren Hill in Mesa, Arizona, and thank you for the invitation today to talk about IOL power selection using artificial intelligence. And by way of disclosure, these are my industry relationships, and I'm the author of the Hill RBF Artificial Intelligence Calculation Method. Now, as anterior segment surgeons, we are primarily being judged by our patients and our peers by our refractive outcomes. And every time we enter the operating room, the elephant that comes with us is IOL power selection. The half-diopter accuracy for most surgeons is around 78%, and I think with today's technology, we can do better. And we can do better by thinking differently. And one way to do this is to use artificial intelligence for a form of pattern recognition. What I'd like to do today is share with you the power of this technology and how it may improve our refractive accuracy. Now, by way of example, let me show you how pattern recognition works. Inside this box are 1,000 little squares, and or crosses rather, and these were placed using something called a Manhattan distance generator. Now, the Manhattan distance between 2 points is as though we were driving a taxi cab through the city of Manhattan in New York and going around the buildings in kind of a grid-like pattern. So the little crosses are not actually random, but they do actually have a pattern. The Euclidean distance, by comparison, would be a straight line as though a bird or a bumblebee were to fly from one end of the city to the other. And we're going to ask an artificial intelligence algorithm to find the internal organization. We're going to give it 5,000 cycles to do that, and with today's computers, that's pretty fast. And that's 40 cycles, 120 cycles, 500 cycles, and by 5,000 cycles, we've actually been able to take this seemingly chaotic collection of data points and find its internal organization. So this technology is very powerful, and why not do it for intraocular lens power selection? Now, the advantages of this over, say, a theoretical Gaussian formula is that it optimizes outcomes based solely on data. And as we all know, manual optimization methods limit possibilities to situations that we already understand. And this makes the best of what's available and is able to bypass certain limitations of physical models. And it's well suited to real-world problems where ideal models may not be available, and intraocular lens power calculations is a wonderful example of that. It's also self-organizing, and it has the ability to create novel representations of data, and it has enhanced sensitivity for identifying and unraveling complex, nonlinear relationships, and it's completely free of calculation bias. So once we have decided what data we want to use, we can make an artificial intelligence model, and in the beginning we used axial length, central corneal power, the anterior chamber depth, and the observed postoperative spherical equivalent for a given IOL power. This was used to create an artificial intelligence model, and the activation function of that model used radial basis functions from which this gets its name. We have an IOL power that's calculated, and we can refine the calculation accuracy by using a back propagation method and adjusting the outputs using mathematical weights until the accuracy does not improve. With less than 1,000 cases in the beginning, we were able to take a cloud of data and turn it into a straight line. And we also noticed that there was no calculation bias whatsoever, whether it was a short eye or a long eye. The only thing that mattered in terms of the number of cases that were beyond a half diopter accuracy was just the number of observations. Now, one very powerful tool that we were able to add to this is something called a boundary model. And those of you who have a background in engineering or should be very familiar with this. A boundary model is a way of sampling the edge of accuracy for a given data set. And in this case, our accuracy edge was 90% for a half diopter accuracy. Those data points that fell outside this boundary model can be flagged as being associated with a half diopter accuracy that is less than 90%. And of course, as we add more and more data, the boundary model increases. So we're able to tell the user prior to surgery whether or not we have a 90% half diopter accuracy for a given target spherical equivalent. So this is version 1 with about 3,400 cases. These are our boundary models. And we'll take a kind of a normal eye, a little bit of a myopic eye, normal case, normal anterior chamber depth. And you can see that all the data points fall within the 6 pairwise boundary models. We'll go to a little different eye, a little longer axial length. Now we have very steep Ks and a shallow anterior chamber depth. And for this early artificial intelligence model, we didn't have enough data to predict the accuracy for this case at a 90% level. So this was flagged as an out-of-bounds calculation. For version 2, with more than 12,000 cases, the boundary model was expanded. And here, the steep Ks are now inbounds, and the shallow anterior chamber depth is now inbounds, and that's an inbounds calculation. Version 3 is what we're working on right now, and this has an expanded boundary model and also a refined boundary model. And we can take a look at a very unusual case where we have a very long eye, very flat Ks, a very deep anterior chamber, and you can see that we have enough data that all of these data points fall within our boundary model. So the more data that we have, the greater the chance of a half diopter accuracy. And in this case, the boundary model is still set at 90%. We have an online calculator that's available to the ophthalmic community. You can go to this calculator and read about what it is we're doing, and you can read about the mathematics if that is an interest to you. And then the calculator asks for which biometer you use, and a number of biometers are accommodated by this. We have some demographic data for the patient, the preoperative measurements, the lens implant you plan to use, and then also the calculation and the boundary status of the calculation. Now, some cases may give an identical intraocular lens power, but some will be inbounds and some will be out of bounds, and it depends on the preoperative measurements. And again, an out of bounds indication simply means that for that particular set of parameters, we don't have enough data for a 90% accuracy. We flattened the power curve for version 3 across a very wide range of axial lengths and IOL powers, and this is shown to be a great benefit to us. Another comparison between version 2 and version 3, this is a very short eye. You can see that version 2, all the cases are out of bounds. For version 3, they're all inbounds. An extremely long eye, some of the cases are out of bounds, and now all of the cases are inbounds. Prior to release, we did an informal study of almost 10,000 cases where none of these surgeries were used to create the artificial intelligence model, and you can still see that we still maintain a half diopter accuracy of 90% or better across a very large set of independent cases. There is an article coming out in the Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery shortly showing that version 3 of the Hill RBF method is now the most accurate IOL power calculation method currently available compared to others that are commonly in use. So version 3 has shown tremendous progress, and this is all that we're using in our practice. It also has the lowest standard deviation of all available calculation methods. So I think the future of ophthalmology is very bright. We have many calculation methods, and the method with the greatest sensitivity and flexibility will probably give the greatest accuracy as technology advances. 78% accuracy is most common, 84% is acceptable, and 92% I think is achievable with what we have right now. And again, this is 78%, this is 90%, and the goal is nothing less than to have 100% accuracy as technology advances, and that elephant in the room will slowly fade away, and we can spend our time on other more important things. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Warren. Well, the next speaker is Graham Barrett. I think that all of us are using their formulas, and for me, really, nowadays is my gold standard. And well, there are several formulas from Barrett, and I think it's a good thing to know how use all of them. Go ahead.
I very much appreciate the invitation from my good friend Jorge Área to participate in the Área Congress this year. I wish I could be with you all in person in Alicante, and hope there'll be an opportunity to do so in the future. Today I'm going to discuss my personal approach on how and when to use the various formulae I have developed. My disclosures are that I am the author of IOL formulae, which have been licensed to several companies, and I've acted as a consultant to both Alcon and Zeiss. There's no doubt that improvements in technology have played a key role in improving outcomes, but equally, if not more important, to solving the puzzle are the formulae required for prediction. The Barrett Universal 2 formula is a Vergence formula based on paraxial ray tracing, and as such, it calculates the principal planes for the predicted IOL. The BU2 formula is available online on the APA-CRS website and can be used with a measured posterior cornea, which is identical to the Barrett TK formula available on the OurMaster 700. Although I have both the Lenstar and the OurMaster, I always do my planning online using the APA-CRS website. If you log on to the website, several formulae are available, starting with the BU2 for spherical IOL power prediction. Data can be entered for both eyes in this formula, the lens model selected from a drop-down menu, and the lens constants will be automatically entered. You can also enter your own personal constant, either lens factor or a constant, but not both, as one is calculated from the other. Select Calculate and then Universal Formula to display the table of IOL powers listed for the predicted spherical equivalent refraction. The BU2 is useful if you would like to calculate both eyes simultaneously. And one subtle difference in this formula and the others is that it can predict an IOL with just axial length and keratometry without ACD, and this can be useful for an aphakic or pseudophakic patient. Personally, however, I believe it's important to determine whether toric IOL is required in all patients. Simply looking at the keratometric cylinder does not suffice due to the multiple vectors. And so I use the next formula, which is the Barrett toric calculator, for all my calculations. If you would like your patients to end up with less than a half diopter of residual astigmatism, then you need to target close to zero residual astigmatism. And this is my practice and the reason for using a toric IOL in approximately 80% of my patients undergoing cataract surgery. The toric calculator is of course based on BU2 and provides exactly the same spherical power prediction, but in addition provides the predicted toric cylinder. The calculator predicts the posterior corneal power for each eye based on a theoretical model, and the corneal surgical induced astigmatism should be the centroid value, which is typically in the range of 0.1 or 0.12 diopters for a 2.4 millimeter temporal incision. A drop-down menu allocates the correct nomenclature, cylinder power range, as well as an optimized constant for the selected toric IOL model. But once again, a personal constant can be entered if preferred. Rarely, a user may wish to select a predetermined IOL power, e.g. from another formula. Similarly, a value can be entered for the optional Ks, so that these Ks will be used for the spherical prediction, whilst the main Ks, e.g. from a topographer, could be used for the toric cylinder. Now, both these options are rarely required and therefore can be ignored in the vast majority of cases. Far more valuable are the integrated K calculator and the measured posterior corneal astigmatism options, which become available after data has been entered and the user selects Calculate. The K calculator allows a user to enter Ks from up to 3 different devices. If 2 devices are selected, the synthesized integrated K is the mean of the 2 devices. But if 3 devices are utilized, which is preferred, then the integrated K will be the vector median K. If you measure the axial length from 2 different devices on the same visit, it is clear that there is minimal difference. The difference in the mean K measured is also minimal, but the correlation from the keratometric cylinder is relatively poor. Measures such as using Warren Hill's validation criteria are helpful, as are optimizing the corneal surface. But measuring corneal astigmatism is not always repeatable. And this is why I use the K calculator using 3 different devices: IOLmaster, LensStar, and Pentacam, as you see here. And after selecting calculate and then toric IOL to display the sphere and toric cylinder recommendation in all my cases. The last calculation used the default theoretical prediction of the posterior cornea. If, however, you select measured PCA, then the posterior cornea values PK1 and PK2 from the IOLmaster, or the equivalent posterior corneal values from the Pentacam, can be entered. The measured posterior corneal power will then be used for the sphere and toric prediction, and this is equivalent to the Barrett TK on the IOLmaster 700. Note the formula uses the measured posterior cornea, as in this example, and not the TK value, as the name suggests. The differences in outcomes using the theoretical predicted posterior cornea or the measured posterior cornea are relatively small and hard to identify with normal eyes, and therefore I tend to use the measured posterior cornea for post-refractive cases or unusual cases, and the predicted posterior cornea for normal eyes. The TrueK formula provides a solution for patients who have undergone laser correction for myopia, hyperopia, and radial keratotomy. The most accurate option, however, is to include the measured posterior cornea in the calculation, the so-called TrueK-TK. To access this method online, select the measured posterior cornea option, which becomes available after entering the data and selecting Calculate. A new page appears where you select the device and enter the measured posterior cornea values listed within the IOLmaster 700 as the PK1 and PK2 values, or corresponding values from Scheinfeld devices. Together with Michael Lawless, we recently published a series of their patients that had undergone previous myopic and hyperopic refractive surgery. The results confirmed that the TrueK, with inclusion of the posterior cornea, provided the most accurate and repeatable option in both myopic and hyperopic patients undertaking cataract surgery without prior refractive information. An important issue that's not widely appreciated is the need for a custom toric calculator when selecting a toric IOL in an eye that has undergone previous refractive surgery. The TrueK toric calculator is available online for this purpose and can also be used once again with the predicted or measured option for posterior corneal astigmatism. Finally, I updated the TrueK formulae a few years ago to include an algorithm for keratoconus. Instead of myopic, hyperopic, LASIK, or RK, you simply select keratoconus, which is now included in the drop-down menu. Yokraton and Ehud Asir recently published a comparison of this new formulae for keratoconus in JCRS. You can see that whilst traditional formulae have a hyperopic prediction error, the TrueK keratoconus solution has a mean error close to 0, with 87.5% of eyes with a prediction error within a half diopter. I hope these tips and recommendations on my personal approach to using these formulae proves helpful in your own practice. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Graham. Amazing. And I thought that I was using perfectly the Barrett formula, and there are more things than I thought. Okay. And the next speaker is, well, now we know how to calculate an astigmatism, but there are problems, and David Harden is going to teach us how to solve the refractive astigmatic surprises.
Hi, this is David Harden from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm excited to participate in this program. I'm going to lecture here on solving refractive astigmatic surprises, and you can see my research and consulting responsibilities there below. When we're trying to decide on a patient that wants refractive cataract surgery, we ask them the questions of whether they are excited about reducing their dependence on glasses and or contact lenses when they have their surgery. And most patients really want their best effort to be able to reduce dependence on glasses. And we need to find out, is that for distance vision or is it distance and near? How are we going to achieve that? And most patients have some astigmatism that we're going to manage at the time of the surgery. Understand that even patients that you don't think are going to want astigmatic or presbyopic correction deserve a discussion about the options. So I've listed a few people here. Those patients that have significant macular degeneration, significant scarring, epiretinal membrane, etc., may not be quite as good a candidates, but still we want to talk to them about that so that we know that they've had that discussion and get an option to talk with it about it with you. Over 70% of patients have a half a diopter or more of preoperative astigmatism. This is very critical to address to get good uncorrected vision. Some of the presbyopic IOLs require additional astigmatism correction, yet some of them will come in a toric fashion. And I utilize this same nomogram for either femtosecond astigmatic keratotomy or with a diamond blade astigmatic keratotomy, depending upon the exact situation. Here I'm marking the meridian that is important for that patient. I usually use a 600 micron setting. This is an adjustable blade, but fixed blade also works quite well. And then basically make the length of relaxing incisions that you need. I usually use a 9mm optical zone, as is being done here. The maximum I use is 2 45-degree arcs, and that's true whether or not I'm using a femtosecond or a diamond blade. For levels of astigmatism 1 or 1 1/4 diopters or more, the toric IOLs are certainly a better option. But even with toric IOLs, we'll need to be prepared for enhancement, whether it's for the astigmatism or whether it's for myopia or hyperopia. But I'm going to talk mostly about the astigmatic potential for enhancement. I tend to enhance large corrections fairly early, but small corrections, a half a diopter or so, oftentimes wait longer because sometimes the patient will just adapt to that residual refractive error. I'll typically wait about a month or so to do an IOL rotation or an exchange for large corrections, and typically 3, 4, or 5 months or so for laser vision correction, because oftentimes the capsule is still contracting around the implant, and there may be some stria that I may want to do a YAG capsulotomy on before I do PRK or LASIK. And I normally would do PRK because many of the older patients will have basement membrane dystrophy. Now, if you have residual astigmatism after a toric implant, it's very important to ask, is the astigmatism regular or irregular? So, for example, this case here, you see on the topography, it's quite irregular, so it's hard to know where that meridian is for this toric implant. In fact, this patient probably wasn't a very good candidate for a toric implant originally. And so, for example, in this patient here, they have a T5 at 150 degrees, but various different refractions, whether you use the wavefront, the manifest, whether you look at the topography. So you have to ask yourself, is this really correctable by rotation of the implant? Obviously, this one here is not correctable by rotating the implant. Again, irregular astigmatism, we tend to utilize the astigmatic calculator that's online called astigmatismfix.com. And this shows that you really can't rotate this implant into a good position. Now here's another case that is something where you can manage this by rotating the implant. So here the keratometry and the pentacam and the IOL master were all slightly different. And this implant happened to be placed at 108 degrees, but there's still residual astigmatism as noted in this manifest refraction. And the wavefront refraction is also slightly different, but still shows significant astigmatism. So in this one here, we're going to run this through the astigmatism calculator, astigmatismfix.com, to see what we should do with this implant. So based upon the astigmatismfix.com, what we find is that if we rotate this implant basically 12 degrees counterclockwise, or you can think of this as a higher amount clockwise because most of these implants will rotate clockwise more easily, then we've minimized the astigmatism. And so basically this is one where it's able to be managed by rotating the implant. In some of these situations, you'll find that you need a higher powered toric, or even if your spherical equivalent is off, you may need to exchange for a different spherical equivalent powered implant. But all these calculators can help you understand that. So in this patient here, again, I need to move this counterclockwise by 12 degrees. And so what I'm doing is marking the current axis, and then I will rotate it 12 degrees counterclockwise, which really is 168 degrees clockwise. Again, you don't have to have a marking in the vertical and horizontal position because of the fact that it's really based upon your assumed location of the implant. So we mark where it is, where it's supposed to be, and then we'll go in, free up the implant. Again, this is something that is easier to do relatively early on, sometime again, typically between 1 and 3 months. So free up the implant, rotate it to the new meridian, make sure it's centered well. If there's significant zonular stress, then I'll oftentimes add a capsular tension ring. I do this all through small incisions because one of the biggest reasons that a patient doesn't achieve the astigmatic result that you want is potentially a wound effect changing your astigmatism. So here you can work through small paracenteses and use bimanual INA if you do add some viscoelastic. Again, making sure that the viscoelastic comes out from behind the implant itself. PRK or LASIK, usually you can use wavefront, is also a very good option after a toric IOL or after astigmatic keratotomy to correct residual sphere and cylinder, and this is a quite useful and works quite well in many patients. There's not an issue with PRK if you've done previous relaxing incisions. Again, many of these patients have basement membrane dystrophy, and so it's typically my preferred approach. Now, IOL exchange is a very critical skill for the modern cataract surgeon, and basically I'm demonstrating this here. This is a patient that decided they wanted multifocality later, as well as astigmatism correction. So I'm freeing up the original monofocal implant, adding a capsular tension ring. With viscoelastic in the bag, I'm putting the new implant underneath it to protect the capsular bag during cutting of the old implant, rotate it into good position, and then basically cut the implant so that it can come out through a small incision. In some of these patients, if you're very concerned about the new incision or opening the old incision from an astigmatism standpoint, you could utilize a scleral incision. And again, this is something that you really, really need to know how to do and be comfortable with if you're doing refractive cataract surgery. So in summary, astigmatism is extremely important to meet our current patient needs and wants. Many patients, in fact, most of them have some degree of astigmatism, low degrees of astigmatism with incisions, toric implants, but be prepared for that residual astigmatic result that you might need to do PRK or LASIK, rotate an implant, or perform an IOL exchange. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. This session is exceptional because we have the top quality leaders in the topic, you know, in this very session. So I want to thank, first of all, the friendship of all of you, David, Graham, Warren, and Jaime, because you have brought the best of the best to this session. David, we use a lot your calculator and to correct astigmatism, so thank you for this huge service. Boris is probably the formula that is most frequently used in Spain and definitely by us. And Warren has put, in my opinion, the scoping what is going to be the future, because we are going to be governed by artificial intelligence, and we shall do in the future a very different way to practice medicine, ophthalmology, and other calculation. So Jaime, now you are in the lead of this discussion. I think that both Paco Pollares and myself will be happy if you can conduct with the assistance of the very distinguished panel that we have, Javier Mendicute, Joaquín Fernández, Giacomo Savini, and Demeterio, the discussion during the next 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. It's a pleasure to have been named the moderator, which I knew just a couple of minutes ago. So I will try to make my best. So I think we had really very, very interesting lectures. I always learn a lot from all of you guys, and it's a big pleasure to listen to them. So starting, for example, with Barrett, who spoke about the importance of the posterior corneal astigmatism and the posterior corneal measurements. My question, and this is of course open to all of you, is do you think that the OCT measurements of posterior cornea, both for spherical equivalent and toricity, have overcome the measurements of the shame flux? And is this measurement a real must-have at the present moment to improve our calculations? Please, Graham, start yourself, and this is open to all of you, of course.
It's a great question, Jaime, and I think for average eyes, the posterior cornea is not essential, both for sphere and for toric. I think there is a small group where it would benefit, but it's hard to show that benefit because it's a small percentage. However, for unusual corneas, like keratoconus or irregular corneas from trauma, and certainly for post-refractive cases, I'm certain that measuring the posterior cornea does provide a benefit. And I'm not sure whether the OCT is actually more accurate than the Scheimpflug. I've not seen a comparison. But the one thing is that there's no standard for the posterior cornea. It's a bit like pachymetry. In the old days, there was no uniformity from different devices. So when you use the posterior cornea, for instance, in my formula, you have to select which device you are using because there are adjustments which are made so that they are standardized, if you like, to the Gould-Strand ratio, because that's what formulae are based on. And yet some companies adjust that internally, some don't adjust it. So unless the formula has knowledge of those variations, you can get less prediction than you would think so. And it's the same for the toric. Yes, it's important to measure the posterior cornea, but it's not the entire story. There's other aspects like lens tilt. And if a toric calculator doesn't include some compensation for that, you may measure the posterior cornea, for instance, by ray tracing, and think you'll get a great result, but you may not, because there's other things to consider. It's not just the posterior cornea.
Other opinions on this?
Well, like Graham, we measure the posterior cornea for penetrating keratoplasty, prior refractive surgery, keratoconus for the toric lens. But what we found is that for normalized, as Graham mentioned, the mathematical model that the Barrett toric calculator uses is probably as accurate or even more accurate than direct measurements. So for normalized, we're still just going with the internal mathematical model of the Barrett toric calculator.
If I can add a comment, I think that the main problem with the posterior corneal measurements is the lower repeatability compared to anterior cornea. I can say this because when I do toric calculations, I always make the average of 3 different machines, 3 optical biometers, the IOL Master, the Tomei, and the Aladdin, and they always show high agreement. And then I take 3 measurements of total corneal power by Pentacam and 3 by Sirius. And even the 3 measurements of total corneal astigmatism by ray tracing by Pentacam, in most cases, show a poor repeatability. And the same is for Sirius, which means that having 3 repeatable measurements of a posterior corneal curvature is hard to obtain with Shamford cameras. And I don't have data about OCT, but I think the main problem is the low repeatability. And if you have a low repeatability, of course, the measurements cannot be relied upon so much.
All right, taking what both Ram and Warren said, we know that OCT, anterior segment OCT companies are working on prediction of IOL tilt from a preoperative lens tilt. So it's particularly for the toric calculations. Do you think, or do any of you have data on if these will really improve the predictions and will allow calculations of toric IOLs based on pure theoretical measurements? Or do you think we still will need these empirical approaches?
Amy, look, it's you have to take it into account, but to give you the big picture, the posterior cornea may be 0.25, 0.3 diopters. The tilt is about 0.1, 0.12. It's not that much. And I'm not certain whether just having a compensation which is empirical for the tilt, for the against rule, I suspect that may be sufficient. Then trying to calculate from pre-op measurements what the tilt is going to be, because the tilt will vary with the lens power, it will vary with the toric cylinder power, it will vary where the toric cylinder is aligned. So it's a fairly complex calculation, and I'm not sure that it's going to make it better. As long as you don't ignore it, I think you can probably get a fairly reasonable account just by an assumed or a derived value from data, for instance.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, but I remember from the paper by Wickert and others who quantify this tilt in the numbers you just said, around 0.1, 0.12 diopters as an average of tilt. But remember that there was a significant, in the paper by Henschel, there was a significant proportion of cases with tilts up to 5 to 10 degrees, which in high power IOLs and high toricities might account for 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. So, I mean, I agree with you for the average of eyes, but there will be cases clearly benefit from getting the tilt lens into the equation. Don't you think so?
Yes, I agree, but difficult to do because you will often only know the tilt after the lens has been implanted, where it actually ends up from an alignment point of view. Is it perfectly centered? All these things will impact. And so a hard thing to predict, a bit like ELP maybe, but worse.
Oh, great, that's good.
Jaime?
Yeah?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
We are seeing right now more and more treatment of laser for presbyopia, trying to modify the spherical aberration on the cornea. Giacomo published 2 excellent papers talking about the calculation, the modification of the calculation with aspheric and spherical intraocular lens. He reported that it's less affected with a spherical intraocular lens instead of spherical. Do we need to take account the spherical aberration in the future, this type of patient? Because these patients are going to be also affected by the anterior and the posterior cornea because of the procedure. Or do we can avoid the spherical aberration in the calculation, Giacomo? Barrett, please.
I did the first of these 2 studies some years ago when I was trying to explain the reason why some eyes have bad results. And at that time, I was using spherical IOLs. Since then, I replied with the aspherical IOLs, and the results were weaker. So I lost my attention on that issue to take the prolate or oblate shape of a cornea into account when calculating the IOL power. So I think it's not more so important, at least in virgin eyes. If you talk about post-LASIK eyes, this is probably different and can be solved more easily by ray tracing.
All right. So, Warren, one question for you. I'm a big fan of your method. I have to say that at the beginning I was very skeptical, but when finally results have proved that it really works so well, it made me think about that. And it's clear that the big difference now with other empirical approaches many years ago is that now we've got a lot of data and very good quality data. And that makes empirical approaches work. And if you think about that, if we've got enough data, finally, both theoretical and empirical approaches should give just the same numbers. So having said this, my question is, will there be an RBF method for post-refractive cases so that now we've got so many cases operated from LASIK many years ago? So will you be able to collect enough data to make this predictive method?
Well, this is a question I'm asked quite a bit. And the difficult problem we have is that it's hard to measure the cornea, isn't it? And the Gould-Strand ratio can be different in different ways in different places across a very short interval. So I've been holding off until we have a little bit better methods for measuring the cornea before we fit an artificial intelligence model. And as you know, artificial intelligence is solely based on the data. And so if the metrics aren't that good, you know, we may be disappointed by the results. For the time being, we're actually concentrating on just normal eyes. And that in and of itself is an enormous job. One of the biggest problems we have, and I think anybody that works on IOL power selection methods will tell you, is getting high quality data from various sources. And that's a really big problem because there may not be the same type of consistency that we might have in our own practice. And we've had to spend a lot of time going through these databases and refining them and making sure that the information that we're using is correct. So that's for normal eyes. Imagine the challenge we're going to have with eyes that have had prior refractive surgery, and that makes it even more difficult. So I think for right now, for artificial intelligence, what we're looking to do is refine the calculation technique for normal eyes, and we'll default to Graham Barrett for his very, very accurate true K method. And by the way, Graham, this is really what we rely on 100% in our practice. And kind of like you, Graham, we do 2-3 of these, per day. So we see large numbers of these. And I think right now the Barrett true K method is pretty much the standard for the world. And I think, most people would agree with that. So to answer your question, Jaime, right now I'm just going to concentrate on normal eyes because that's still a very, very big job for us.
Right. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jaime. I think one more question only. One more, and we have to finish the session.
Yeah.
Please.
I have two questions. It's obvious that you are the experts, and I have more questions than answers. But the first question is for Jaime, because you are going to talk about calculating multifocals after refractive corneal procedures. But finally, you have presented two cases of monofocal intraocular lenses. Face it with an irregular cornea or one decentered cornea. When do you consider correcting the cornea, before or after the pseudophakia? And the second question for everybody. We are improving the calculation methods, the formulas, etc. But then, if we don't know the real power of the intraocular lens, it's possible to improve the predictability of our procedures with these small mistakes. No, we don't know the real power of one intraocular lens of 20 that is marked 22.5, for example. No?
All right, answering to the first question, whenever I face a very, let's say, a decentered cornea after LASIK, of course, I first do my customized treatment with a laser to obtain a center optical zone. So I do that always the first. Then I wait for 6 months, and then I do the cataract surgery. So that's the question. And it's the good point is that in the old days, when we did the centrations, the hard part was to calculate the compensation with the laser for the final refraction. But when you are doing cataract surgery, that compensation is not necessary anymore, as you are going to fix it with the IOL. So that's the order. First, customized treatment with the laser, 6 months, and then the IOL. So, and I let the others to answer to your second question about, I understand tolerance of labeling of IOLs on this issue.
Yeah, I'll take this question. First of all, lens manufacturers do much better than the ISO standards for intraocular lenses. So if an ISO standard is such and such, a lens manufacturer has a greater tolerance for that. The other thing it's helpful to remember is that the total overall accuracy of lens power calculation is a multi-part process. It's not based just on the axial length or just on the IOL power or just on the keratometry. And by error analysis, it's the square root of the sum of the squares. So what that means quickly is that if you take one part of a multi-part process and make it perfect, it doesn't affect the outcome as much as you would think. And that's why half diopter steps have been the standard for ophthalmology. Now that we have better measurement technology, now that we have better calculation methods, I think we may be moving towards the exact power of the lens. Now, this may be an inventory nightmare for manufacturers, or even going to quarter diopter steps, but I think we're getting to the threshold where our measurement and our calculation technology is good enough that we can move from half diopter steps to something different.
Thank you.
Okay,
right,
I think that
Jorge,
we have had an outstanding session, and we're going to close. I think that, well, I want to thank Jaime, excellent leadership on this session. Warren, Graham, and David, thank you for being here today in Alicante, this sunny day, from so far away, taking your time and indeed taking your experience and talent in building up what we use every day in our patients. Now we have a last message from Biotech that is going to close the session, and this message is from this company that is sponsoring this session. Thank you very much, and excellent. Thank you. Good job.
Nos estresa que la lente se pueda voltear.
Un paso importante, o sea, es una lente muy buena.
Y esto no va a pasar con la lente acrílica.
Y especialmente tamaños de 13, que nos van a hacer que tengamos un control.
El material de la lente Optiflex es un material muy resistente a la formación de microvacuolas.
And this may be the best hydrophobic in lenses I've never implanted.
Y con una rapidez de resultados bastante impresionante.
Es una de las escasísimas lentes con las que me siento cómodo.
Confirman una respuesta excelente a todas las distancias.
De una manera mucho más agradable, mucho más amistosa y con menos posibilidad de que podamos encontrar algún volteo a la hora de poner la lente en cámara anterior.
O sea, quirúrgicamente se comporta de forma excelente y el aspecto de la lente es excelente.
Los estudios de laboratorio sugieren una gran seguridad.